I hear footsteps outside my tent. They aren't animal sounds. That was the last thing he ever wrote. The final entry in a diary meant to be a plain, boring record of rocks and streams, but it became the sole witness to a nightmare. Before we start, do me a favor and comment below where you're watching from because, clears throat, the story we're about to tell took place over 100 years ago, back in 1911, deep in the mountains of North Carolina. And even now, no one can fully explain what happened to Nathaniel Burke. The Appalachian Mountains back then, folks, this wasn't your nice, friendly hiking trail. This was a place where civilization simply stopped. Dirt roads faded into deer trails, and deer trails faded into nothing. Valleys so deep the sun only reached the bottom for an hour each day. Communities lived cut off for weeks at a time, ruled by their own laws, their own secrets, and those mountains knew how to keep secrets well. Nathaniel Burke was 32, a city man from Richmond, Virginia. He was a cartographer, a mapmaker, hired by the railroad company to find a route, a way to carve through the wilderness with steel and steam. He was a man of science, of numbers. He didn't believe in stories. He believed only in what he could measure. And he wrote everything down in his diary. Every temperature, every rock formation, every person he met. That habit, that careful, scientific habit, is the only reason we know his story. It's the only reason we know something went terribly wrong. In March of 1911, he left Asheville with 3 weeks' worth of supplies. He was heading into the deep country, a place called Shelton Laurel. Even other mountain folk whispered about Shelton Laurel, a place of deep caves and treacherous canyons. His job was to map it, to find a route. Simple. It was lonely work, but he liked it. He hired just one local guide, a man named Ezra Whitlock, a quiet, leather-tough man born in those woods. They said Ezra knew every trail like the back of his hand. But there are some trails you should never walk down. The first few days were just work. Cold March wind, trees still bare and gray. The only sounds were the constant rush of water and the crunch of their boots. Nathaniel wrote in his diary, weather damp, progress slow, topography more challenging than expected. He noted that his guide Ezra was competent but not much for conversation. That was fine with Nathaniel. He was there to work, not make friends. But on the 5th day, everything changed. They were high on a ridge when Ezra stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed. "We go around." Nathaniel looked through the trees. He could see a cabin. An old, tumble-down homesteader's hut. "It's just an empty cabin, Ezra. Might be a good spot to shelter for lunch." Ezra shook his head, and for the first time, Nathaniel saw real fear in the man's eyes. "That place ain't empty. It's waiting. We don't go there. Bad stories. Bad stories." Nathaniel was a man of science. He scoffed. "Stories are for children, Ezra. I need to see what's on that hill." He pushed past the guide, who stayed rooted to the spot, clutching his rifle. Nathaniel walked up to the cabin. The door was off its hinges. He stepped inside, and the air went cold. It wasn't empty, it was abandoned, but left in haste. Plates sat on the table with rotten food still on them, a pot on the cold stove, clothes hanging on pegs stiff with mildew. It was as if whoever lived there had vanished in the middle of dinner. But that wasn't the worst part. He looked closer at the walls, and his blood turned to ice. The wooden planks were covered in symbols, scratched, carved deep into the wood. They weren't letters. They weren't any Native American marking he recognized. They were spirals and sharp, angular lines arranged in patterns that made his head hurt just to look at them. He was a mapmaker. He recorded what he saw. He pulled out his sketchbook and began to draw them, his hand shaking just a little. "Primitive," he wrote, almost violent in their execution. "I cannot decipher their meaning." Ezra was outside yelling for him to get out. "Leave it be, city man. You don't know what you're messing with." Nathaniel ignored him. He'd noticed something else, a loose floorboard near the hearth. Curiosity, it's a powerful thing. Sometimes it's a fatal thing. He got his fingers under the board and pried it up. Beneath was a small, dark hole. He reached in, his fingers brushing against something dry and brittle. He pulled it out. It was a small, strange object, a bundle of twigs tied together with what looked like human hair. And wrapped inside that bundle was a single, small, yellowed tooth. A child's tooth. Nathaniel stumbled out of the cabin, gasping for air, holding the thing in his hand. He looked at Ezra, about to ask him what it meant, but Ezra wasn't looking at him. He was staring, pale as a ghost, at the woods behind the cabin, clear his throat, as if he'd seen someone. "We leave," Ezra whispered. "We leave now." Nathaniel, shaken, finally agreed. He showed Ezra what he'd found. The guide recoiled, slapping the bundle out of Nathaniel's hand as if it were a venomous snake. "You fool!" Ezra hissed, his voice trembling. "You touched it. You never touched the markers." They argued. It was the most Nathaniel had ever heard the man speak. Ezra wanted to turn back to Asheville right then. Abandon the whole expedition. Nathaniel refused. He had a job to do. The railroad was paying him. He wasn't going to be spooked by some mountain superstition. Finally, Ezra gave in. But he was a changed man. That night, the tone of Nathaniel's diary shifts. It becomes rushed. Day 6. He wrote, "Ezra is acting strangely. He will not speak. He just sits by the fire, his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the light. He keeps looking back the way we came. He insists we are being followed." Nathaniel tried to reason with him. He was a man of logic. "Followed by who, Ezra? We haven't seen a soul in days." Ezra just looked at him, his eyes dark with a terror Nathaniel couldn't understand. And he said the words that Nathaniel would write down in his diary word for word. "There are things in these mountains that maps cannot show, and places where sensible men do not go. You kicked their door, and now they know we're here." Nathaniel slept with his pistol in his hand that night. On the 7th day, it happened. He was woken up in the blackness of 3 a.m. He thought it was the wind or a branch scratching the tent, but it wasn't. It was voices. He sat bolt upright. He wrote in his diary by lantern light, his hand trembling so hard the letters are barely legible. "I hear sounds from the valley below. Not normal voices. They have an unnatural echo, as if coming from inside the land itself. A low, guttural chanting." He scrambled out of his tent. Ezra was already on his feet, rifle at his shoulder, staring into the dark. "Do you hear that?" Nathaniel whispered. Ezra just nodded, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. "They're calling. They're calling to the mountain." The sounds lasted an hour. A horrible rising and falling chant that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that fell was worse. It was heavy. Total. They waited side by side until the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. They hadn't said another word. When the sun was finally up, Nathaniel let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He turned to Ezra to plan their next move, and his heart stopped. Ezra's bedroll was empty. Nathaniel looked around the camp. Ezra's pack was still there, his food, his extra blanket. His rifle was leaning against the tree where he'd been standing. But Ezra Whitlock was gone. Nathaniel was alone. Miles from civilization, in a place locals were terrified of, with a missing guide and the sound of those voices still ringing in his ears. He did what any man would do. He panicked. He yelled Ezra's name until he was hoarse. He fired his pistol into the air, 3 shots, the universal signal for help. Nothing came back but the echo, swallowed by the trees. He spent the entire day searching. He walked in circles around the camp, wider and wider, looking for tracks, a sign of a struggle, anything. There was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches. It was as if the ground had just opened up and swallowed the man whole. This was the moment. The moment any sane man would have cut his losses. He had Ezra's rifle now. He had plenty of food. He had his maps. He could have followed his own trail back down the mountain to Asheville and told the sheriff. But Nathaniel Burke was a man of science, and a proud man. He wouldn't be scared off by bad stories and a guide who panicked and ran. Maybe Ezra just got lost. Maybe he was hurt. Or maybe it was something else. He wrote in his diary, "I must continue my work. The company expects results. I will also keep an eye out for Ezra. I cannot abandon him, but I have a growing sense of unease. I feel as if I am being watched." He made a fateful decision. Instead of going back, he packed up his things, shouldered his pack, and picked up Ezra's rifle. And he kept going, deeper into Shelton Laurel. His notes for the next 3 days are short, rushed. He's not writing about rocks anymore. He's writing about other things. Day 8, I feel I am being watched. I keep seeing movement at the edge of my vision, but when I turn, there is nothing there. Day 9, found footprints. Not animal, not human. They seemed to parallel my trail, keeping their distance. He was a man of science, but his science was failing him. He was terrified. He was lost. And he was being hunted. On the 10th day, he found it. He was following a stream up a narrow gorge, hoping it would lead to a pass. He pushed through a thicket of rhododendrons and stopped. It wasn't a hut. It was a shrine, built against the face of a sheer cliff, hidden by vegetation, a structure made of piled stones. It was low, like an artificial cave, and the smell. He forced himself to get closer. He looked inside and nearly threw up. It was filled with bones arranged in strange circular patterns on the floor. Animal bones, he thought at first. Deer, bear. But the way they were arranged, it was deliberate, ritualistic. And the walls were covered in those same symbols from the cabin, not scratched in wood this time, but carved deep into the stone. In the center of the shrine, he saw something else, stones stained with something dark and rust-colored. Nathaniel was no longer a scientist. He was no longer a mapmaker. He was a witness to something unholy. He wrote in his diary, his handwriting a frantic scrawl, "I have stumbled upon something terrible. This is not a place for maps. This is a place of sacrifice. I must leave. I must report this to the authorities." He grabbed a few small objects from the shrine, a carved stone, a piece of sharpened bone, as evidence. He stuffed them into a small canvas bag. He scrambled away from the shrine, made camp miles away near a stream. He was finally going to go home. He'd had enough. His last complete entry is dated March 23, 1911. "I will go down at first light. I will follow the stream until I find the main road. I have kept evidence. Something terrible has happened in these mountains. It may still be happening." He finished writing. He closed the book. He was sitting in his tent, trying to calm his breathing, listening to the sound of the stream. And then he heard another sound, a twig snap just outside the canvas. He froze. He picked up his pen, opened the diary to a new page, his hand shaking violently. He wrote one last desperate line, "I hear footsteps outside my tent. They are not from animals." 6 weeks passed. Back in Asheville, the railroad company filed a missing person report. But in 1911 in Appalachia, men who went into the mountains and didn't come back, well, it happened. The mountains took what they wanted. The case went cold before it even began, until a fur trapper named Thomas Hargrove was checking his lines in Madison County. He was following a deer trail when he saw something, a piece of torn canvas caught on a thorn bush. He was a curious man. He followed the trail of torn fabric down into a narrow, damp valley. And there, half buried under a pile of wet leaves, was a leather backpack. It was Nathaniel Burke's. Inside was the diary, his measuring tools, his half-finished map, and the small canvas bag, the one with the evidence from the shrine. Hargrove couldn't read, but he knew a diary when he saw one. He took the bag to the town of Marshall and gave it to the sheriff. Sheriff Edmund Calloway was not a city man. He was born in those mountains. He'd been sheriff of Madison County for 20 years. He knew the people, and he knew the stories, the ones people told in whispers about things that lived in the deepest, darkest woods. Stories most people laughed at. Sheriff Calloway never laughed. He took the diary home. He read it from cover to cover. The next morning, he didn't send a deputy. He didn't just file a report. He organized a search party. 12 men, all of them tough, experienced locals. He even deputized Thomas Hargrove to lead them back to where he found the pack. They set out on a foggy May morning. It took them 3 days of hard climbing just to reach the area Nathaniel had described. The trails were gone, washed out by spring rains. On the 4th day, they found it, the camp. It was a scene of pure, violent chaos. The tent was still there, but it had been shredded, not torn by a bear, not ripped by the wind. It was cut to ribbons, as if by dozens of knives all at once. The tent poles were snapped like twigs. Nathaniel's gear was scattered everywhere. His pots and pans were bent as if something with incredible strength had simply crushed them. One of the men found Nathaniel's rifle, the one he'd taken from Ezra. It was propped against a tree. It was fully loaded. The safety was still on. He never even fired a shot. But there was no body, no blood, no sign of a fight, just chaos. And then silence. The men were spooked. They wanted to leave. But Sheriff Calloway wasn't done. He looked at the ground. Spread out, he ordered. Look for tracks. One of the men, a farmer named William Jessup, shouted. He was 50 yards away near the creek bed. The search party ran over. Jessup was pointing at the mud. Sheriff, what in God's name is that? Sheriff Calloway looked down, and his blood ran cold. They were footprints, but they weren't right. They looked human, but they were huge, easily size 20. And the depth, whatever made them, weighed far more than any man. They were also barefoot in the freezing mountain mud. Even worse, the tracks weren't leading anywhere. They were circling. The tracks circled the camp over and over. Whatever had been outside the tent had been watching him for hours before it finally acted. Calloway, his face grim, made a decision. We follow them. The men were terrified, but they trusted the sheriff. They followed the massive bare footprints. The trail led them away from the destroyed camp, down through the thickest, darkest part of the forest into a narrow canyon. Walls of rock rose up on either side, blocking out the sun. The only sound was a stream rushing over the rocks, and the tracks led them right to it. The stone shrine. It was just as Nathaniel's diary had described, a low, artificial cave built against the cliff face, covered in vines, and those symbols carved into the rock. The men stopped. A few of them crossed themselves. A Methodist minister in the group, Reverend Yates, began to murmur a prayer. It's profane, Yates whispered. This is a place of darkness. Sheriff Calloway ignored him. He drew his pistol, lit his lantern, and ducked inside. It was just as the diary said, the bones arranged in circles, the stained stones, the smell of old blood and damp earth. He was about to leave to tell the men that Nathaniel had been telling the truth, but then his lantern light caught something else. It was half buried under a pile of animal bones in the very back of the small cave. It wasn't Nathaniel's. It was another book. This one was ancient. The leather binding was stiff and cracked. The pages were yellow and thick. He pulled it out. The men gasped. He opened it. The handwriting inside was archaic, written with a quill pen. The ink was faded. This book was old, maybe 100 years old. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. A record. Sheriff Calloway flipped through the pages. What he read, he never told anyone, not the full story. But the men who were with him that day said they saw the sheriff, a man who had seen war and death and everything in between, start to shake. His face went white. He slammed the book shut. "We're leaving," he said, his voice hard. "Get down from here now." "But Sheriff," one of the men started, "what about Burke?" "Forget Burke," Calloway snapped, stuffing the ancient book into his own pack. "We need to get out of here before nightfall." But they were too late. The sun was already setting. The climb down the cliff face in the dark was suicide. They were trapped. Calloway made the hard choice. "We camp here at the base of the cliff. Build a fire, a big fire. Nobody sleeps. Everyone keeps a rifle in their hands. We watch in shifts." The men were quiet, terrified. They built a bonfire. The flames leaped high, pushing back the oppressive darkness of the gorge. But it didn't make them feel safe. It just made the shadows around them seem deeper, darker. Reverend Yates read his Bible out loud, his voice trembling. Thomas Hargrove, the trapper, just stared into the woods, his rifle never wavering. Sheriff Calloway sat apart, staring at the flames, his hand on the backpack that held that book. It was around 3 a.m., the darkest, quietest part of the night. William Jessup, the farmer, was on watch. He suddenly grabbed the sheriff's shoulder. "Sheriff, listen." Everyone froze. At first, there was nothing, just the fire crackling and the stream rushing. And then they heard it. It was coming from above them, from the stone shrine. A sound of dragging, of heavy stones being shifted, and footsteps, heavy like the ones they'd seen in the mud. Something, or someone, was in the shrine right above their heads. The men aimed their rifles up at the dark cliff. "Who's there?" Calloway yelled. "Show yourself." The dragging sound stopped. And then from the darkness above, a small avalanche of pebbles rained down on them. Calloway grabbed his main flashlight, a big, powerful electric torch, and aimed the beam up at the cliff, at the mouth of the shrine. The beam cut through the darkness, and everyone saw it. For just 1 second, a silhouette. Standing on the ledge, looking down at them. It wasn't a man. It was huge, taller than any man, and broad. It just stood there watching them. And then it was gone. It didn't climb down. It didn't run. It just moved backward into the blackness of the cave, too fast to be human. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just fed the fire, making it burn so hot it seared their faces, and they waited for the sun. When the first gray light of morning finally came, they didn't walk. They ran. They scrambled down the mountain in a desperate, panicked rush. They didn't stop for rest. They didn't stop to eat. It took them 2 days to get back to Marshall, half the time it had taken them to go up. When they stumbled into town, dirty, exhausted, haunted, they found a crowd waiting for them. The men who had gone back earlier had spread the story. There was even a reporter from the Asheville newspaper. Sheriff Calloway pushed past all of them. He went straight to the office of the county judge, Albert Morrison. He locked the door. He was in there for 3 hours, just him, the judge, and the ancient book he'd found in the cave. When that door opened, Judge Morrison looked as pale as Sheriff Calloway. He called an emergency meeting, the mayor, the head pastor, the biggest landowners, behind closed doors. What was said in that room was never made public. But the result was that Judge Morrison himself sent a telegram to the governor of North Carolina. He didn't talk about monsters or shadows. He used careful legal words: disappearance of 2 men. Disturbing discoveries. Potential security threat in remote regions of Madison County. Request state assistance. The governor responded. He was sending help, a contingent of 10 state militia armed with the latest rifles. And he was sending his best investigator, a man named Henry Blackwood. Blackwood was the opposite of Sheriff Calloway. He was a city man from Raleigh. He wore a suit. He was a modern man, a man of forensics and cold, hard logic. He had a reputation for solving impossible cases. He brought cameras, fingerprinting kits, even a primitive sound recorder. He arrived in Marshall and set up in the local boarding house. And for a full week, he didn't go near the mountain. He just interviewed. He spoke to Thomas Hargrove, the trapper. He spoke to every man in Calloway's search party, one by one, documenting their stories. And then he read the evidence. He spent an entire day with Nathaniel Burke's diary, making notes, comparing the maps. Then he asked Sheriff Calloway for the other book, the old one. Calloway hesitated, then handed it over. Henry Blackwood took that ancient ledger to his room, and he didn't come out for 2 days. When he finally emerged, he called a meeting with Calloway and Judge Morrison. He looked shaken. The skeptic was gone. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low, "what you have here is complicated." He laid out his findings. "The old book," he said, "is exactly what you thought, a record, a ledger kept by a group, what I would call a cult, dating back to the early 1800s. He explained that the book was filled with rituals, beliefs, a worship of the mountain itself, and a list of names. I cross-referenced the names in this book," Blackwood said, "with state and federal missing persons records going back 70 years. Gentlemen, they match, dozens of them. Travelers, trappers, settlers who went into those mountains and were never seen again. This book is a record of their sacrifices." Calloway and Morrison were horrified. A secret, murderous cult living in the mountains for 100 years. But that, Blackwood said, is not the most disturbing part. He opened the ancient ledger. He turned to the very last page, a page that was stuck to the back cover, which Calloway had missed. Blackwood had carefully steamed it open. The page was new. There was writing on it in a different ink, a modern fountain pen. The handwriting was messy, rushed, terrified. "They're still here," Blackwood read, his voice trembling. "The symbols are warnings." Ezra knew. That's why he ran. "They're not stories. They're records." Calloway looked confused. "What does it mean?" Blackwood pointed to the handwriting. "I've spent a week studying Nathaniel Burke's diary. I've cross-referenced every letter, every loop." He looked up, his eyes wide with a terrible new understanding. "It's Nathaniel's handwriting." The room was dead silent. "What? What are you saying?" the judge finally whispered. Blackwood pointed to the page. "Burke found this book after he fled the shrine, before the end. He must have doubled back. Or maybe it was left for him. He read it, and he added to it." Blackwood pointed to the last frantic scrawl at the bottom of the page. "If anyone finds this," he read, "do not go up at night." Nathaniel Burke hadn't just been running from something. He'd been running from someone, a community, an isolated, hidden group living in those mountains, sacrificing anyone who stumbled upon them. The abandoned hut wasn't abandoned. It was a trap. Ezra, the local, must have known the stories, realized what Nathaniel had done, and fled for his life. Or had he? "What about Ezra?" Calloway asked. "Did he get away?" Blackwood shook his head. "I don't think so. Burke's diary says Ezra's rifle and pack were still at the camp. A mountain man like him would never leave his rifle." A new, colder theory settled over the room. Ezra hadn't run. He'd been taken silently in the middle of the night. And Nathaniel, he was just the next one on their list. A new expedition was organized. This wasn't a search party. This was an army. 25 men, Clear's throat, the 10 state militia in uniform, Henry Blackwood and his 2 assistants, Sheriff Calloway and 5 of his bravest local men, including Hargrove and Jessup, and porters carrying weeks of supplies, rifles, ammunition, and dynamite. If there was a community up there, Blackwood was going to find it, and if they were hostile, the militia was authorized to respond. They set out on July 6, 1911. Half the town came to see them go. An old woman, Mother Thornton, reportedly grabbed Blackwood's arm. "The mountains hold what the mountains take," she whispered. "You won't find what you're looking for, but you'll find something." Blackwood wrote it down in his notes, local superstition. The first 5 days were tense. They followed the same path. They found the destroyed camp. Blackwood took photographs, collected samples. He bagged the bent, crushed cookware as evidence of extreme physical strength. They established a fortified base camp near the creek with armed sentries posted 24/7. On the 6th day, they reached the cliff, the stone shrine. This time they were prepared. The militia captain, a man named Peters, sent 3 soldiers up first, ropes and rifles ready. Then Blackwood and Calloway followed. The shrine was just as they'd left it, the bones, the symbols, the dark stains. But there was something new. Sitting in the very center of the cave, right where Calloway had found the ancient ledger, was Nathaniel Burke's sketchbook, the one he'd used to draw the symbols from the hut. It was open to a specific page. And on that page, written in charcoal in big, crude letters, was a simple 2-word message: "Go away." The men were stunned. This wasn't history. This was now. Someone had been there, after Calloway's first trip. They knew the search party was back. They were being watched. The militia captain, Peters, was furious. "They're playing with us. They're up here somewhere." Blackwood, the investigator, was looking closer. He examined the charcoal writing. He touched it. He sniffed it. "This is interesting," Blackwood said. He pulled out a piece of charcoal from his own evidence bag, a piece he'd recovered from Nathaniel's first campsite. He compared them. "It's the same," he whispered. "The same specific type of pine, burned in the same way. This message, it wasn't written by the cult." Calloway looked at him, confused. "Then who?" "I think," Blackwood said, his voice barely audible, "Nathaniel Burke wrote this. I think he's alive. This changed everything. He wasn't just a victim. He was a captive, or a fugitive hiding in the woods, trying to warn them." The mood of the expedition shifted. It was no longer an investigation. It was a rescue. Captain Peters increased the guards. That night, the camp was silent, oppressively silent. Even the insects and frogs were quiet, as if the whole mountain was holding its breath. The next day, Blackwood divided the group. Half would stay and fortify the base camp. The other half, led by Blackwood, Calloway, and Captain Peters, would push deeper, following the footprints. Following the feeling. They moved in tight formation, rifles up. It was Sheriff Calloway who found it. He'd lived in these woods his whole life. He saw things other men missed. "Here," he whispered, pointing to a break in the trees that looked like nothing. They pushed through, and they found it. It was a village, but not a village of cabins. It was a series of crude shelters built from bent branches and bark, camouflaged so well they were almost invisible. It was a temporary camp, and it was fresh. The ashes in the central fire pit were still warm. There were things, primitive tools made of stone and wood, piles of animal furs and bones, boiled bones split for marrow. They had just missed them. Whoever lived here had seen the 25-man army coming and had evaporated, melted back into the woods. The soldiers started searching the shelters. Over here, a young soldier shouted. He was holding something, a piece of fabric, dark blue, snagged on a branch. Calloway and Blackwood ran over. Calloway knew the fabric. He'd read the report from the railroad company. It was the exact material and color of the shirt Nathaniel Burke had been wearing when he left Asheville. He was here. He had been living here. He's alive, Blackwood breathed. He was with them. Was he a prisoner, or had he joined them? Then Captain Peters shouted, "My God, Sheriff, look at this." He was pointing at a large flat rock in the center of the clearing. The rock was dark, stained, and around it, carved into the dirt, were those symbols. But that's not what Peters was looking at. He was pointing up at a tree on the edge of the clearing. Hanging from a low branch, twisting slightly in the breeze, was a small carved wooden figure, a little doll. It was dressed in a tiny scrap of cloth, the same cloth as Ezra Whitlock's shirt. And the doll's eyes had been gouged out. It was a warning. A threat. And then they heard it, a sound from deeper in the woods. A shout. "Help! Please help me!" It was a man's voice, an educated voice. "It's Burke!" Blackwood yelled. "He's alive!" Captain Peters gave the order. "Move! Move! Move!" The squad of soldiers, Blackwood and Calloway, charged through the woods, crashing through the undergrowth, following the sound of the voice. In here, the voice yelled. "Hurry!" It was coming from a cave, a dark opening in the side of the mountain they hadn't seen. "Mr. Burke!" Blackwood shouted, running toward the cave mouth. "We're here. We're coming. It's a trap!" Calloway yelled, grabbing Blackwood's arm. "Peters, stop!" But it was too late. The soldiers, pumped with adrenaline, ready for a fight, charged right into the darkness of the cave. Blackwood, desperate to find his missing man, shook off Calloway and ran in right behind them. Calloway and the few remaining men skidded to a halt at the entrance, raising their rifles. They heard the soldiers inside, alight. "Get flares!" A moment later, a bright red flare was lit, illuminating the inside of the cave, and the screaming started. It wasn't a cave. It was a chamber, a massive underground cavern, and it was filled with them. They were on the ledges, in the crevices. Dozens of them, standing silent, watching. They were human, but wrong. Pale, oversized, with long, matted hair. Their faces were inbred, distorted. And as the flare light hit the floor, Calloway saw their feet. They were bare. And they all had 6 toes. The family from the ledger. And the voice that had called for help, it hadn't come from Nathaniel Burke. It came from one of them, a huge, hulking figure at the back of the cave. It had been mimicking Burke's voice. It was a trap. The last thing Calloway saw before the flare died was Captain Peters raising his pistol. Then the cavern exploded into a nightmare of sound. Gunshots, the roar of the militia's rifles echoing, deafening in the small space, and screaming, not from the soldiers, but from the things, a high-pitched, guttural roar as they dropped from the ledges. They didn't have guns. They didn't need them. They had rocks, clubs, and their bare, powerful hands. They moved with a speed that wasn't human. They fell on the soldiers like wolves. Calloway and his men outside started firing into the dark mouth of the cave. "Blackwood!" Calloway screamed. "Get out!" A soldier stumbled out of the cave, his face a mask of blood, clutching his chest. There, he collapsed. Calloway saw a shape lunge out of the darkness. One of the creatures, its eyes reflecting the light. He fired his shotgun. The thing fell. "Fall back!" Calloway yelled. "Get the dynamite!" One of his men, Jessup, the farmer, was sobbing as he fumbled with the pack. "They're all dead, Sheriff. They're all dead." Light the fuse. Calloway roared, firing into the cave again. They heard Blackwood scream. One last, terrible, cut-off scream. Jessup lit the fuse. Run! Calloway and the 5 survivors, all that was left of the 25-man expedition, threw the lit bundles of dynamite into the mouth of the cave and ran. They dove behind the rocks just as the world exploded. The explosion was massive. The sound of it echoed off the mountains for a full minute. The entire cliff face shuddered. Rocks and dirt rained down. The mouth of the cave was gone, buried under tons of rock. Silence. Calloway and his surviving men, shaking, bleeding, broken, just stared at the pile of rocks. They had sealed the tomb, on their own men and on the things. There was no rescue. There was no investigation. There was only survival. They didn't even go back to the base camp. They just went down. They walked and crawled for 2 days back to Marshall. The official report? A training accident. The militia, unfamiliar with the terrain, had been practicing with explosives near an unstable cave system, Clear's Throat, a tragic cave-in. 10 soldiers, 2 state investigators, and 5 local volunteers lost. Case closed. The governor classified the entire file. The railroad company immediately canceled the Shelton Laurel project, citing geological instability. No one ever went back. Sheriff Calloway retired a year later. He never spoke of what happened in that cave. He kept the ancient ledger, the one from the shrine, locked in a safe. But the story doesn't quite end there. Years later, just before he died, Calloway's son found him sitting in his study, staring at that old leather-bound book. The sheriff was an old man. His hands were shaking. "What is it, Pa?" his son asked. Calloway just pointed to the last page, the page that Nathaniel Burke had written on. His son looked. There was Burke's frantic warning. "If anyone finds this, do not go up at night." But underneath it, there was new writing. In that same archaic quill-pen script from the rest of the book. The ink was fresh. It was just a new list of names, the names of the men who had died in that cave-in. Captain Peters, the soldiers, and the last 2 names on the list, Henry Blackwood and Nathaniel Burke. The explosion hadn't killed them all. They were still down there in the dark. And someone, or something, was still keeping the records. They're still here. So, what do you think? What was that ancient family living in the mountains? And who is writing in that book today? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of history and mystery that they don't want you to know about, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay out of the woods.